Good morning. How is everyone? Today we're going to look at the Apology of Socrates. So we've done this introduction to the Platonic dialogues. We've seen that Socrates is the central figure in all the dialogues. He is the philosophic hero of them. He is this new Platonic or Socratic hero that is to displace first Achilles and then Odysseus. In the same way that Plato seems to really have been in competition with Homer, right? We've talked about the quarrel between poetry and philosophy about who would rule the youth and rule the city by extension. He who rules the young through education rules the city, in effect, if indirectly, right? We talked about dialectic and that a philosophical conversation is able to happen in a philosophic context. We've got a drama here. These are situations. This is not abstract discussion. This is a drama based on real life in the sense that we've talked about the function of literature as opposed to history. History gives you facts, and literature gives you situation based on facts that history gives you particular facts, but literature gives you examples, maybe not exactly what happened, but rather the kind of things that do and have and always will happen, and therefore are universal. And that's important because the context here is a trial. Socrates, in the Apology of Socrates, the setting is Socrates is on trial in 399, defending not just his bodily life, he is defending really, truly, his way of life, his life of philosophy against the city, its opinions, its biases, its unexamined way of life, and he represents the examined way of life, and we'll clarify exactly what that is. The Apology of Socrates. The first thing we should notice is that, or note, is that this is perhaps the most biographical dialogue of Plato, in which Socrates, in defending himself, we're his lawyer. Socrates, what is your defense strategy going to be? His strategy is very clear. He's going to explain his life, his way of life, his philosophic way of life, the examined life. His life is exemplary. It is the personification of the examined life. And his traditional mode of examination involves a specific form of speech and reasoning that has a specific goal. And that form of speech is called dialectic. And dialectic is really just a fancy word for the Socratic method that we all know, a question and answer process that elicits an initial response, and then that response is interrogated. And we keep revising our original assertion till we get at something that's more like the truth. And that seems, that question and answer process, I think Plato is presenting as the kind of paradigmatic way that human beings can, if they can at all, can reason together and get, if not the truth, something that's approximate to the truth. Right? And so that type of discussion only happens in certain contexts. Right? Most of our discussion, and this is an important general point of reference about how this fits into our lives in general. This is not the normal way we talk, number one, and normally it is not the primary goal that we pursue in our conversations. We don't seek the ultimate truth about things, for a lot of starting with practical reasons, and then also turning to matters of sensitivity between individuals. Socrates is not in that context where he can speak privately, and if dialectic is questioning things fundamentally, questioning the beliefs that have been given to his society, right? He needs a context in which he can openly and freely be skeptical about the conventions, about the assumed and received truths and opinions. He has to be able to question. We'll see in Plato's Republic, Book 7, he has to question the shadows on the wall. Those shadows will be the opinions of the city or of society. They will be they will be the things that people believe in as the reality, not just of the city, but of the order of things, the nature of things as such. So he needs a circumstance to. This is a radical thing to do. This is a rebellious thing to do. This is a threatening thing to do, not only to people's beliefs and opinions and feelings, but also their reputations. And this has something to do with why, when he starts questioning those three classes, he questions the poets, he questions the politicians, and he questions the artisans. It has to do with why they react the way they do, right? And ultimately, his questioning is potentially threatening to the city itself. Because if he's questioning the foundational beliefs of the city, let's say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. If he's questioning things like that, he's questioning the core principles and beliefs on which the whole foundation of the order, the peaceful, harmonious order of society is based. So what context is Socrates in here? He is not in a context where he can question the beliefs of the city directly, because who is he speaking to? He's in a jury, he's in a trial situation speaking to 500 Athenian citizens who are in effect both the judge and the jury of his guilt or innocence. Now your first reaction is, I'm going to say what I have to say to get off the charges, right? And as you know from reading this, or when you do read it, you'll realize he apparently seems to do very little to really try to refute the charges at all. It's called the Apology of Socrates. We think of an apology as saying, I'm sorry, a mea culpa, right? The Greek word for apology is apologia, and it literally means a defense speech. And it is precisely the kind of forensic speech that one gives in a courtroom, right? So in one situation and context, we have dialectic, where we seek the truth, and in another speech, we seek to defend ourselves against charges that we've broken the city's laws, right? And we should raise the specter of this right now. Is the courtroom a place for truth? Philosophy, through dialectic, seeks the truth. Is a courtroom the place where truth is going to be found? And the most superficial answer is yes, because there's a threshold of evidence, and people come before a trial, and they swear to say the whole truth and then nothing but the truth. Socrates tells us at the outset, I am going to give you the whole truth, right? And if we look more carefully at a trial, what is it dependent on? Your guilt or innocence? Is it dependent on the truth? Yes and no. It's also dependent on the opinions of your fellow citizens and a jury, right? Do they fully comprehend the truth? Do they understand the truth? Do they all have the facts to discern it? At the end of the day, it comes down to their opinion, right? And in fact, a jury trial is less concerned with the truth and more concerned with the justice of a democratic process in which a majority of people reach a conclusion, and whatever the majority say is the truth, right? Is truth determined by what the majority opinion is? In a democracy, in our own society, it very often feels that way. But of course, that's rubbish. That's rubbish. Let's turn to the charges for a minute, and then we'll get into the PowerPoint and get into the text. But he's 70 years old. This happens in 399 BC, after he's lived a long life. Somehow he's avoided charges up to this point, for whatever reason. But he is accused of not properly believing in the gods of the city. Number 2, of introducing new gods into the city. And number 3, in corrupting the youth. Now, the important observation to be made here is that these charges are seen to stem directly from the particular type of life that he has been living as a philosopher. What does he do? What does a philosopher do? If we look at all the Platonic dialogues, if Socrates is the personification of philosophy, it's very clear what philosophy is. It's raising fundamental questions, but by simply raising the question, it is an acknowledgement that you do not accept the answers given by your society, that the evidence they've provided for the truth of their answers is not sufficient to you, and you want to determine based on reason and evidence, a logos, what the real answers are to how to live, what is justice, what is virtue, these fundamental questions raised by the Platonic dialogue, right? Where then do the opinions of society come from if not truth? Personal biases imposed on the society. Classic theme of ancient philosophy is the notion that the rulers shape society, and they shape it from their own point of view, and they make laws that suit their own interests, but also their beliefs. So what we believe in society is not a function of the truth, it's a function of being forced through laws, through habits, through education, to believe, to conform to the beliefs, and therefore, in addition, connected, the expectations of your society. If you want to get by in society, you are forced to pay homage to a whole set of concepts that if you really sat down and thought about it, you might discover we're not either fully the whole truth or totally accurate, or you might come to the conclusion that they're some cases fundamentally wrong, right? It's not hard for us to look at Nazi Germany and say the belief in the superiority of the Aryan race is so obviously wrong. But if you're a Nazi and you believe that, you can see the powerful impact historically that it had. And if you didn't believe that in Nazi Germany, what would be the consequences for you? If you, for example, publicly proclaimed that it was a falsehood, right? You would not be, your career wouldn't be going very far, right? So what we believe is effectively based primarily on tradition. And everything I'm saying now is setting up the Apology, but it is also going to feed into Book 7 of the Republic quite nicely. We believe things based on traditions, and those traditions have been established by people with the sufficient power, the sufficient capacity to impose their perspective on society at large. And obviously it's no single individual or single group, but the origin of all these beliefs in some way, shape, or form is that they've been accepted and promoted by certain groups of people over time in history. You need only think of the founders, right? American founders had a conception of what they saw as the proper and just society, and through the Revolution, and through the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution, and the early stages of the American government that they were also involved in, they really shaped an attitude of their belief about what the society proper was that has carried forward to our own day. And we ask the question, do we believe in the principles of the founding of our country based on the fact that they are true, or based on the fact that it is simply the opinion we hold because it is necessary in our society to hold those opinions? So we might hold them rationally because we've analyzed them, but for the most part, we function in society based on unexamined opinions that we think and like to believe are true, but we really do not know whether they are true. So all societies have a fundamental element of tradition built in them. They're perpetuated and reproduced from one generation to the next, 1 year to the next, 1 decade to the next, by handing down beliefs that make the society work, whether they're true or false. And we accept them on the basis of their traditional authority. Philosophy and Socrates, as the embodiment of philosophy, comes along and says one thing and one thing only. The basis for the authority of an opinion cannot be tradition. The basis has to be that it come before the scrutiny and tribunal of reason and judged based on reasoning, which is to say logic, and evidence, empirical evidence that I can see and or infer from what I see, and that if it's rational, if it's true because it's past the tribunal or litmus test of reason, then it is true. You know, an opinion or a belief could be true or false. but you don't know whether it's true or false because you've never examined it. So this rational scrutiny is the essence of the examined life. And this transitions us into what I want to talk about. I want to just talk about the structure here of everything. We're going to look at philosophy and the city, this tension between Socrates' way of life and the city, and we've started to establish that. We're going to look at his modes of speech, the way he speaks. We're going to look at the setting, and then we're going to look specifically at how he defends himself or doesn't defend himself. Because if you've read carefully, I think you'll notice that you don't really feel that if he really wanted to get off, he's really said the things he needed to say to get off. And think about that. If you really want to get off in a trial, it might not be a matter of directly saying the truth. What might matter most is saying what people want to hear. Saying what people want to hear. So let's establish one fact that will be relevant to the allegory of the cave. Ask ourselves the question. We think of the coronavirus. The people who should give us information about the coronavirus and what to do should be the scientists. Trust science, trust the scientists, because they're the rational ones. They're looking for the objective truth, the objective medical, epidemiological truth about, the virus and so on, its effects and so on and so forth. Right? We live in the aftermath of our founding and the 18th century, which was considered the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment essentially wanted to enact on a collective level what Socrates attempted to do on an individual level in his own private life. As much as he was out in public, he did not initiate some kind of political movement. In fact, he says if he had gotten involved with politics, he would have been dead really quickly. And part of the reason we discover is he just doesn't care about other people's opinions because he wants the truth. And when you don't care about other people's opinions, it's like you're not respecting them because their opinions are derivative of them. Right? An Enlightenment society was such that in the 18th century, and we'll still carry this deeply with us today in our kind of cultural DNA, that society should be based on facts and reason and evidence and truth and logical consistency, right? And that the Enlightenment's basic premise was that all the injustices of the ancient world, the pre-modern world, the early modern world prior to the Enlightenment, were the result of society being based on faulty opinions, superstitions, fantasies, myths. And of course, at the center of that was religion. And of course, it's very clear if you look into the history of the church, the way in which the authority of church is based on its core religious doctrines, its founding religious principles, which religion by definition is non-rational in the sense that it's based on revelation. It's based on the very antithesis of empirical evidence that we can all see and agree on with our eyes. It's based on people getting this divination of what God told them and told them about how they should live, right? So they saw society that if every element of society, the division of labor, education, economics, political, religious, if it was all filtered or brought before the tribunal of reason, that the cause of all the injustices was built on living on faulty opinions, and that if we could live in the light of the truth, we would for the first time on the planet, and I'm overstating a little because thinkers differed, but there was certainly this impulse, that for the first time on the planet, we would live in a truly just world, and all these problems we saw around us would dissolve away because they were based on a power structure that was based on, let's just say it, lies and myths. All right, let's be bold. The shadows of the cave. Now, in Socrates' day, Athens was one of the most open societies there was, right? There was more free speech, and in fact, a version of free speech was promoted in Athens, particularly in the assembly and society at large. as this was a place where if you have a good idea and you can make a good argument, you can be heard, right? It was what we would call an open society. It's a word philosopher Karl Popper uses, the open kind of liberal free society where people can speak their mind. We notice very quickly that Athens turns out to be a fairly ancient world, an ancient world in the sense that it is not a place where you can simply say anything, right? Socrates, the charges against Socrates have to do with religion, and you realize that he's living in a theocracy. Well, we live in an enlightenment, and let me step back here. Socrates can't simply say whatever he wants. There is free speech, but it's up to a limit, and certainly you can't question publicly, the existence of the gods, right? Why? Because they are the foundation of the political order. In ancient Greece, there was a notion that the origins of the city, its way of life, its laws start with the divine origin, the gods. And to question them is to both be impious and break the law and challenge both the authority and the order of society. We live in a world entirely influenced by the Enlightenment and natural science. And we should ask ourselves, do we really live in a society that is singly oriented by the truth? 1. Question 2. Can any society be fundamentally oriented to the truth and function? Right? I think, well, how do you know how much we're concerned with the truth? Well, ask yourself what we're not permitted to talk about in our society. And that's for you to think about, and I may give some examples later on. What are we not permitted to talk about in the society? Does the media, does Hollywood, do they tell you certain beliefs that you're not supposed to have? Do they tell you certain things you're not supposed to say? And I'm talking about things that may not even really, if you think about them, they're not necessarily hurtful or bigoted in any way. They're just a different point of view. Is the environment of New York City open to all points of view? If you're really interested in the truth, you're interested in the truth. You're interested in hearing everything to discern what's really true, because you can't really discern what's true unless you've seen the full perspective, right? And I think, New York is a fairly open place in a lot of ways. It's a very tolerant city, but in some ways, there are certain points of view that are, not bigoted or anything of that nature, but they're just not, you're not to say that. You can't say that. It's heresy, right? All right, so you don't get burned at the stake today, but, things might happen to you on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. We look, for example, at the censorship, not necessarily of the government, but of places like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I ask you, what is going on there? Why do they censor things that seem to be a different point of view, not inherently bad, not inherently bigoted, but they're just not permitted? And I'll give you one example. YouTube recently said that it would censor any video that made statements that were contrary to the World Health Organization, as if the World Health Organization was the fount of truth, and that if you say anything contrary to them, your videos will be taken off YouTube. Now, in a free society with genuine free speech, you're permitted to say things that are not true, right? Well, everybody can be wrong, so of course you have to have the leeway of being able to say things that are not necessarily true, because what the truth is partly what's at bait. That's why we're having a conversation, right? So then you have to ask yourself the question, why is our society doing this if we claim to be oriented toward the truth? If we claim to be oriented toward free speech? Because clearly, at least on certain topics, in certain ways of speaking, we do not have free speech. I think very clearly. It's on paper, but effectively the speech gets suppressed for various reasons. And the classic model of people who today advocate for free speech is what they call a marketplace of ideas. And the marketplace of ideas is like basically you kind of let people say what they want. They express their opinion. And in the First Amendment is the centrality of being able to express one's opinion, because that's an extension of your life and how you live it. You live your opinions, right? If that's your opinion, that's how you live your life in relationship, oriented to that opinion, right? The marketplace of ideas says, let all the ideas out there. Let's have a free market. And you know what? The shitty ideas are going to go down because people they're not going to pay attention to them. And the good ideas will be in competition with other good ideas. And the really good ones will rise to the top because people will just assess them based on their own reasoning, what they think is true, what they think is false, what they think is a good idea. We don't need censorship of the kind we're speaking, right? Maybe we censor fire in a theater when there's no fire and things like that. We can, it's another conversation, the limits of free speech. But here we're talking about types of speech that should be and are and have been protected under the First Amendment. So Socrates is guilty, in a sense, for all the things he said. That's what he's being convicted on, the way he's carried himself, particularly what he said. And then I want to come, back to these charges. He has not acknowledged properly the gods of the city. Does that come through in his speech, that he doesn't respect the gods of the city? Number 2, he's brought in new gods. Now, what's that charge about? The daimonia. The daimonia is like his own personal spirit. And it's some kind of voice in his head that tells him typically what not to do. And I think if we look at a non-supernatural context, when we look at this daimonia, what we see is something like conscience or something like prudential judgment. But when he talks about this thing that stops him from doing things and makes him make certain judgments, he conceives of it as this a kind of demigod, as some kind of spirit that is not just in his head but transcendent, and it is a kind of religious belief as such. And whether he really takes this to be something more than his voice in his head is dubious, right? So this is the God that he has introduced to the city. Then the question is, he's corrupted the youth. Let's touch on that charge. What is he, before we say whether to judge him as having corrupted or benefited the youth, let's think about what he actually has done. He had, his friend Chaerephon had gone to the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle of Delphi is like the source of intelligence, where you, is a kind of priestess there, a kind of prophet, and you go and ask them, serious questions, consequential questions, because you need answers, you need for a course of action. And Chaerephon goes to the Oracle of Delphi and asks, who is the wisest man of Greece? And the answer given is, there is no man wiser than Socrates in all of Greece. So Chaerephon, his friend, comes back to Socrates and says, yo, you know what I heard? You know what I heard from the oracle? Said, there's no one wiser than you. Right? And Socrates says, that can't be right. That can't be right, because the only thing I know is that I know nothing. The only thing I have knowledge of is that of my own ignorance. So it is this oracle, he says, that then propels him to go and speak to these three groups of society. Right? He speaks to the poets, the politicians, and the artisans. And it turns out that the three accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, are all representatives of those three groups of people, those three factions within society. And what is the role of the young here? How do they get corrupted? Well, when he's interrogating the politicians, when he's interrogating the poets, when he's interrogating the artisans, the young, the kind of young adult men, like teenage to early 20s maybe, they're, say, college age, something like that, high school, college age, I would think. They're all standing around him, watching him use his reason and his argumentative skills. Does Socrates, is he a clever speaker? I think the answer is yes, right? He has been practicing cross-examination his entire life, right? And what does he do? He tears them down to size. He tears them down to size. And what happens when the students or the kind of followers watch? They're thrilled by it. They get the kick out of it because these luminaries of their society are torn down to size and exposed. As frauds might be too strong a word, but what they were reputed to have known and have developed a reputation for, it turns out that they don't actually know those things. And Socrates shows them. They just have a reputation. They just have an appearance for knowing. And why does Socrates do this? Because he wants to prove actually that he's not the wisest. He says he wants to prove the oracle wrong. And he actually says this is an article of faith. This is a kind of pious mission he's on, which is a strange way to be proving it wrong. So these are the charges, right? These are the charges. And now I turn to the question of, in light of what he said, is he guilty? Is Socrates guilty of these three charges? Let's think about, before we give an answer to this question, and I'm not going to give my own definitive answer, but Socrates is considered in the history of human civilization, Western civilization, as the most just man there is. Plato celebrates him as the most just man, the most righteous man. Right? So our first thought is, this man is a luminary. I don't know, the Martin Luther King of his day, the Gandhi of his day, the Jesus of Athens, something like that. Right? He sits on par with Jesus as a righteous dude. Our first response is, he can't possibly be guilty of doing these bad things because he's Socrates. He's a great guy. And it's obvious. I mean, look at it. He doesn't really do anything bad to people, does he? He doesn't harm anybody. That's one of his principles in his life. Do no harm, like a doctor, right? He's a doctor of the soul rather than the body. So I come back to it. Do you think he's guilty? I think, ironically, he doesn't defend himself very well, right? And if you look carefully, we'll read some passages, you realize that he doesn't really address the charges very directly, and when he addresses the charges, he actually misconstrues them and recites them in a way that's not accurate to the original charges, number one. Number two, before he even addresses the charges of Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, he says there were charges before these guys. You know, these guys are young guys. They're trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to use this as a political bludgeon to elevate themselves and make a political name. He says before that there was a play called The Clouds, written by Aristophanes. This is true. 423 BC, there was a play called The Clouds, in which Socrates is the main character, the historical Socrates, and his head is literally in the clouds, and it's where we get this expression, having your head in the clouds. And it presents a very out-of-touch Socrates who is acquiring into things in the heavens and below the earth. And this is kind of coded speak that they all would have understood for a philosopher, but particularly a natural philosopher. When I spoke about in the introduction to the dialogues that philosophy had started out inquiring into the natural world, everything under the sun or in the heavens and below the earth. What's above and what's below? What's above the earth and what's below the earth? That we know what the myths tell us. Up there is Mount Olympus, the heavens, and Christians call it heavens, and below is hell, Hades, right? And we know that. We don't need to look because we've read it in Homer. And that's true. We don't need to investigate with our eyes. We just need to accept what the mythic stories have told us in how we orient ourselves to the world. So, when Aristophanes accuses him in this play, and notice this is a play that's supposed to be funny, and yet Socrates takes this play very seriously. very seriously as really the primary accusation against him that has influenced the jury, influenced all the minds in that jury, and predisposed most of them to have a negative opinion of him. And those who looked above and below were considered atheists, because they were looking at things that the religion had already answered questions to, and they shouldn't be looking into themselves. So it was a kind of coded way of talking about an atheist. And Socrates, in essence, these first two charges, has to defend himself against the charge of atheism, right? But then, of course, he says, how could I be an atheist? I believe in my daimonia. But then how does he understand his daimonia? He goes around trying to prove, and I believe in Apollo, which is connected with the Oracle of Delphi. Yet he tries to show his piety by trying to disprove Apollo's oracle. Right? You see there's a problem there. What then is Aristophanes' play? What is Aristophanes' play? What's the significance of it structurally within the city of Athens, or society as such, right? Because this is all a microcosm of society at large. This is part of our society, not just ancient Athens. We haven't transcended the problems that are raised here, although we like to think we do. And that's exactly one of the problems we have, is that we think we've transcended these kind of problems, because we certainly have boundaries on our speech and thought. While it's not promoted by religion, it's promoted by other means. And precisely because we don't have religion first and foremost as a dictator of what we think and believe, we think we're not being influenced, because we're not being influenced by a church or a mosque or a synagogue, at least not through the state. It's a private matter. What's the function of the clouds? The clouds, in essence, is poetic propaganda that presents a shadow on the cave wall of society that all the other citizens see, that they believe Socrates is a bad guy, right? And of course, if you've met him, you might not reach the same conclusion. All right, to come back. One of the classic ways of interpreting these charges is that they're simply political, and that they don't have a sufficient basis in fact. And of course, we know Socrates is a great guy. More recently, there have been a series of interpreters, including the editor and translator who wrote the introduction to your text, that really takes these charges quite seriously. And then, in fact, not only are they legitimate charges, that Socrates is likely guilty. Does he give a convincing speech? Does he try to justify himself and his way of life in front of the tribunal of the city? Not the tribunal of reason. The tribunal of the city is made up of a majority of people with opinions and emotions and attitudes and reasons to be critical of Socrates for various reasons. So, let's say you read it and you came to the conclusion that, boy, he's really guilty. He's really guilty. Well, doesn't that mean by definition he's a bad guy? Right? I mean, the city makes laws on the basis of how they understand what's right or wrong, good or bad, just and unjust. What's going to contribute to the well-being, the commonwealth, the communal good, the happiness of the city? If someone has broken the laws, they haven't just broken the laws. Come on, folks. I know we have this relativism. You break a law, you're really not bad. Right? But we're in a democracy. You make the laws like you made them. And if you break them, you're breaking what you thought was, it's unintelligible. So how can we reconcile the fact that Socrates is guilty, or may well be guilty, and yet we see him as a good man, and maybe not just as a good man, but as a most righteous man? And, I don't think everyone's going to have that opinion. There's always kind of generally two mindsets with things in between, but on one hand, many people see him as righteous and just and good, and he's really done nothing wrong other than If you have a taste for the truth, you see the justice in him. On the other hand, you see how he is very smart alecky. We might even say sassy. He puts down his audience, which is the one judging him on his life or death. The unexamined life is not worth living. Well, he's living the examined life. Who is living the unexamined life? Many of the people in the jury. What is he saying to all of them? Your lives are not worth living. Your lives are worthless to me. Worthless. Now, if they really understood what he was saying there, they're ready to put him to death. I think a lot of them. So how can we reconcile his guilt and our natural instinct that he's a good man? Well, there's only one answer. And it's the same problem encountered by Martin Luther King when he speaks out against the injustices of the laws of Jim Crow America and segregated America. If we decide that the justice of the city is not truly just, and that maybe even the right thing to do is civil disobedience, because you can think of what Socrates does is a form of civil disobedience, you're going to have to establish a higher law than the city which justifies you breaking the law of the city. Now you sit there and say, Martin Luther King, it's so obvious that segregation is wrong, it's unjust, it's evil, right? But what is the standard of justice in a democracy, folks? The standard of justice in democracy is what the opinion, for the most part, there are important exceptions in a constitutional republic, but generally speaking, justice means what the 51% of the people think and want about the society. That's our definition of justice. We think that the democratic consenting to law, that the majority opinion be expressed through law, is by definition what justice is. Right? And of course, there's another thing lurking here, folks. Many of you are naturally inclined to say, well, good and bad is all relative. In one society, you do it in one way, in another society, you do it another way. And you'll say that on a lot of things, like what people eat and how they dress, and how they say hello to each other, or how they blow their nose. But when it comes to inequality and things like slavery, you very quickly come to the conclusion that slavery is never... If you're really a relativist, slavery is appropriate for one society, and maybe not another, but it's all arbitrary to begin with. What you're going to have to establish is a natural law. In light of what human nature is, what is a human being, this is how they should live, and therefore, based on how a human being should live, then this is what is just, and this is what is unjust. And I think what we'd have to say is, in light of what a human being really is, Socrates' way of life is more in conformity with the justice of the right way of human life, and Athens is just based on biased opinions of society, the shadows on the cave. Right? So how are you going to square that circle? Right? And that is the great conundrum. And I think also the great conundrum that Plato is presenting us is there is no truly just society. Right? For a number of structural reasons that if you read all Plato, you start to see why. But there is no just society. There is no utopia. The very idea of utopia is one in which it is a no place. Literally, utopia means a no place. It doesn't exist. Right? And yet there are politicians trying to take us to that promised land every day. Probably just asserting their own interest in a veiled way under it all. Which is, as you get older, you start to get more skeptical about grand designs to bring about the wonderful age. If only we did this, if only we did that. So the point is, the problem of Socrates, a truly just man, just by human nature, on the standard of human nature, rather than the standards of the biased opinions of society, how should he live his life? How should he operate? Well, his solution, at least at 70, is to stand up and be a martyr for his way of life and for what he sees as a truly just way of life. We should also keep in mind that he was a very good citizen of Athens. He did many things that many people actually thought were incredibly, incredibly just. Okay. So I want to talk about a few more things here. To come back again to philosophy and the city. Philosophy seeks the truth, and the city is the cave of opinion. Right? We are all so used to conforming to the opinion of our society that we start to confuse truth and fiction, because we know that conforming to the expectations in terms of belief and attitude of our society is going to get us what we need. The point is, here at 70 years old, Socrates doesn't care anymore, and he's frankly willing to die, right? Many interpreters have asked, would Socrates have done this when he was 45 or 30 or 25? I think the answer is no. I think he would have gotten his butt out of these charges. But at 70, he's willing to be a martyr, to sting the rear end as a gadfly of the well-bred horse of Athens. And he's willing to sacrifice his life. Why? Because he's lived his life. And he's willing to accept the finitude of his own existence. So, to the extent that he does, what is the primary defense that he gives? The defense that he gives is not exactly a direct refutation of the charges. In fact, he doesn't do that almost at all. And in fact, it all has to do with a matter of perspective on how you view his life. Do you view his life from the perspective of truth and philosophy? Or do you view his life from the demands of the opinions of the cave, the false beliefs that have tremendous power and hold us in thrall? If you take the side of most of the people in the jury who convict him, right, he's guilty. If you take the side of the truth, if you're a real partisan of the truth, you see that he is the great innocent. But he doesn't bother trying to refute the charges, which actually leads us to believe, I think, that he's guilty, and he's even implicitly acknowledging that. And the central focus of his defense is explaining the way in which he went to the politicians, the poets, and the artisans to ask them about what they knew. And what they knew, or was purported to know, was the basis of their success in their professions. Right? So he gives an apologia, which is a forensic defense speech defending himself in the courtroom. And he does many interesting things. He claims he's not a clever speaker. He's never been in a courtroom before. This is funny because Athens was a particularly litigious society and people were in courtrooms all the time. And the fact that he wasn't in the society, in the courtroom, is rather odd. And he says, I'm going to speak the whole truth. And he says that on more than one occasion. And you might ask yourself, if you're speaking the truth, why do you need to make sure to let everyone know that you're speaking the truth? And there's an important distinction. In the opening of the dialogue, he gives a preface on how he's going to speak. And what's really important here is to compare the way he says claims he's going to speak compared to what he actually says, because some of his claims might not line up with what he actually does, and the difference between what he says and what he does here. You would think that a courtroom is a place of evidence and facts, but as we all know, it's a democratic environment in which you have to appeal to the hearts and minds of a jury to get them to find you innocent, right? If anyone of you has actually been on a jury or been in jury duty, you know that they do not select people based on their capacity to discern the truth. In fact, they don't want people who have been lawyers. They don't like people with a college education. They want people who are going to be emotionally swayed by the story that they're told. So, for example, if you go into jury selection, you will actually see that process unfold in the voir dire process, in which the lawyers look over the potential jurors. What people actually use in a courtroom is really a form of courtroom rhetoric. That's really what an apologia is. And rhetoric, by definition, is a mixture of truth and lies. And why is that? Because rhetoric's the art of public speaking, but really more specifically, it's the art of persuasion through speech. And to persuade someone of your point of view or your opinion is not about doing it necessarily through truth, although you could. Excuse me. It's about using whatever means necessary at your disposal to get them to believe what you want. That means ultimately, very often anyway, appealing to their emotions and appealing to what they want to hear, and flattering them. I ask you a question. Does Socrates flatter his audience, his jury? I think the answer is no. Does he really care about getting off? I think the answer is no. Socrates is famous for his irony, and I think he employs it very explicitly throughout this speech. The Greek word ironia is the original word that we have for irony. And what is irony? We're going to get to that. It originates from a Greek comic character named Iron, who used a clever underdog. He used his wit repeatedly to triumph over the boastful Alazon in a Greek drama. And this is exactly what Socrates does. He conquers people with a kind of wit. Irony is a kind of wit, a kind of cleverness, right? And notice, at the outset, he says, I am not a clever speaker. And what he really means by that is, I'm not a rhetorician. I don't speak giving persuasive speeches. However, it turns out that he has incredibly adept skills at speaking, even if it's not the typical courtroom variety, and he knows how to handle himself perfectly well if he wants to in the courtroom. So is Socrates a clever speaker? It's ironic. The answer is yes and no. And it's almost kind of double irony. Irony typically is saying the opposite of what you mean. But here he says the opposite of what he means, but also it is true and false at the same time. It's a very interesting kind of statement. Irony in the original Greek, and it's somewhat lost on us, but you see why, is associated with dissimulation and a pretended ignorance. And that's exactly what Socrates does. He pretends to be dumber than he really is. He pretends not to be a clever speaker when he really is. And why is it dissimulation, dissembling, is deceptiveness, which is connected with lying, right? Verbal deceptiveness is what you call lying, right? It's irony is deceptive because you say the opposite of what you really mean, right? To give you an example of irony, the New Yorker says to the person from California, gee, it's raining outside. It's pouring cats and dogs. And they say, gee, what a wonderful day it is. And what he really means is what a shitty day it is. And, the problem with the Californian is he looks at us, yeah, man, it's a great day, right? It's lovely, right? Irony, therefore, speaks with two voices because there's two meanings. There's the literal meaning of what's stated, and then there's the actual meaning. And the problem of irony is not everybody gets it. And throughout this whole speech, Socrates is speaking on two levels. On one hand, there's literally what he says and its meaning, and then there's what's clearly intended beyond it. Is Socrates a clever speaker? Yes, he's a clever speaker. In a sense, he's lied and not lied, right? And the question is, what do those people in the audience hear? Because if we look at the highlighted portion here, this definition of irony, if irony has two voices, it says one thing and then its opposite, it also has two audiences. One who is following on the level of just what they hear, and the other who is inferring beyond what they hear to what's actually being meant, or what's really being said. And how you appreciate, how you understand Socrates has a lot to do with how you take what he's saying. So here we just have a little outline of the first accusation, of the first accuser, and the second accusation, and the second accuser. So the first one is Aristophanes in the clouds. And he's charged by Socrates, and this is kind of a slightly metaphorical charge because he's not actually in a courtroom. But public allegations are serious enough. There's a title of a book by a very famous lawyer and law professor. It's called Guilt by Accusation. Guilt by accusation. Meaning what? Just by being accused, people saying words, makes you guilty. And the question is that, we're in the Me Too era. Is that evidence enough of your guilt? And for some people it is, right? And of course, in society, when people hear things and you start to realize that other people believe a certain thing, you're going to be inclined to believe what they do just to kind of get on in society. So you don't need evidence. You just need a lot of people believing something for it to become true, right? The charges are that Socrates is a natural philosopher and an atheist, right? Then the second accusers come along in the present, because that's about 24 years prior. And Meletus, Lycon, and Anytus, Meletus does a lot of the talking. You notice that their backgrounds are identical to the people that he queries and cuts down to size. So you see something very funny, which is that you can see why they're bringing these charges, because they are irritated at the slanders that have been created by Socrates in cutting these people down to size. The second charge is impiety, introducing new gods, and the corruption of the youth. When you read this drama, you really have to see it as a speech. You have to see it as a speech, and you have to imagine the circumstances. It's a trial, and that matters. When Socrates is speaking, he's speaking to the reader in a sense, but he's speaking to those jurors, and you have to think about how they are reacting to his speech. And let's put it very simply. There's going to be two audiences. One who takes what he says at face value, and the others who interpret his real meaning. The trial happens in a set way, and therefore the speeches he gives reflect the structure of this trial. The defendant makes a speech defending themselves against the charges. And then, number two, the jury takes a vote on guilt or innocence. If they're found guilty, the defendant is made to make a speech arguing on behalf of an appropriate punishment that then will be voted on by the jury again. So it's interesting that in the sentencing phase, which is what you call it today, that the defendant themselves gets to propose something publicly to the jury. And, of course, he's found guilty because he hasn't done much to defend himself. And what does he propose? He says for his guilt, I should be feted and honored like Achilles or a hero at the Olympic Games by taking free meals in this thing called the Prytaneum. And the Prytaneum was this is a historical institution, a cafeteria where the great people of Athens were given a kind of honorary meals in recognition of their great deeds at the Prytaneum. So, obviously, the jury does not agree with that because he's guilty. And this, I mean, you can imagine how flippant, how ironic it is that he's even proposing this. And on one hand, he's not serious, and on the other hand, he's very serious. He thinks his life has done a great service to Athens, and while he hasn't argued effectively, he has made that basic argument, although it doesn't directly address the charges, because I think he knows himself he's guilty of them and doesn't care. But he does try to illustrate how he's done something great for Athens. The question is, will the jury see it? Will the jury see it? So, there's going to be people who say this man is a great man and he's deserving of this, and other people are going to be irritated that he's just been found guilty of the charges, and of course they sentence him to death. And they didn't want to do this. He really seems to have forced their hand here. And then he makes a speech in response to the final vote. And at that point he knows he's going to die, right? That's the sentence, to drink the hemlock, which is the picture I have on the PowerPoint here. Not on this specific slide, but the general image, the painting by Jacques-Louis David. A man who's going to die, who knows he's going to die, has what? He has nothing left to lose. So at that point, he says the unexamined life is not worth living. And he seems to be implying, without explicitly saying it, that the lives many of his fellow citizens, perhaps all the ones who indicted him and convicted him, are living worthless lives. So let's read a little bit from the beginning. And in this opening speech, he explains, this is a classical rhetorical device in a kind of preface or a prologue. He's going to explain how he's going to speak to them. And he says this. He's speaking in front of 501 jurors in a kind of large auditorium space, and he's facing them all, right? You see the drama. And you have to, as a speaker, a public speaker, what you're doing is thinking about how your words are going to impact your audience. And of course, you have to intuit this because they don't, this is a situation where he is the only one speaking, right? And I would like you to think about, as you read, how his words are impacting. These are ordinary Joe and ordinary Bob Smith sitting there looking at this strange character, Socrates. Some people see him as a hero, and others see him as the gadfly in a negative way. How you, men of Athens, have been affected by my accusers, I do not know. All right, so he doesn't know what they really think of him, right? He doesn't know, and he has to assume things. Now, my accusers, this is very interesting. The real accusers are the people who brought charges against Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. But is he actually talking about them? We'll discover he's not. He's talking about Aristophanes' clouds. He says that is the real accuser. That is the one who's done real damage to my reputation. He actually dismisses the people who have actually brought the charges before him. Can you imagine going into a courtroom and, number one, not directly discussing the charges at hand, but bringing up something totally tangential? And number two, saying, yeah, these people here who are bringing charges against me, they're a bunch of kids looking to make a name for themselves. They're nobody. These other people, Aristophanes and the clouds, those are the real charges. Now, just think about the disposition you would create in the mind of the jury if you actually did that. You are already gone a long way to being found guilty, because we're not talking about truth here. We're talking about, the biases and opinions, the feelings of people. And if you don't respect them properly, and you don't respect the context of the courtroom, which is what he's not doing, and to respect the authority of it as a democratic institution, are you a Democrat or are you an advocate of truth? Because if you're an advocate of truth, there's one truth, and it is what it is, independent of people's opinions. If you're a Democrat, it means I believe, and I want to believe what 51% of the people believe, and I should follow that. I'm oversimplifying there a bit, but only a little bit. For my part, even I nearly forgot because of them. So persuasively did they speak. Well, who spoke persuasively? That was Aristophanes. And yet they have said, so too nothing spoke and nothing true. I wonder most of all of the many falsehoods they told, when they said that you should beware that you are not deceived by me, since I am a clever speaker. So, is he speaking cleverly right now? Yes, because nobody knows exactly what he's talking about. He's actually talking about Aristophanes. They are not ashamed that they will immediately be refuted by me indeed, in action. So how is he going to refute the charges? By depicting the actions of his life. As soon as it becomes apparent that I am not a clever speaker at all, this is Socrates. The claims in the Platonic dialogues that he never lost an argument. He's not a clever speaker, of course. Right? This seemed to me to be most shameless of all, unless, of course, they call a clever speaker one who speaks the truth. So he claims to be here to speak the truth. For if this is what they are saying, then I too would agree that I am an orator, but not of their sort, which is to say he's not a rhetorician, he's a philosopher who speaks the truth. So they, as I say, have said little or nothing true, while from me you will hear the whole truth, but by Zeus, men of Athens, not beautifully spoken speeches like theirs, adorned with phrases and words. Rather, what you will hear will be spoken at random in the words that happen to come, that I happen upon. For I trust that the things I say are just, and let none of you expect otherwise. So he says, I'm not going to adorn my phrases. What does a public speaker do? They adorn their phrases with rhetoric, with appeals to emotions to try to get you to believe what they want you to believe. And he says, I'm going to speak plainly. The truth comes in a plain, direct form, unadorned. For surely it would not be becoming men, for someone of my age to come before you fabricating speeches like a youth. And men of Athens, I do very much beg and beseech this of you. If you hear me speaking in my defense, with the same speeches I am accustomed to speak, both in the marketplace and the money tables, it's dialectic, where many of you have heard me, and elsewhere, do not wonder or make a disturbance because of this. For this is how it is. Now is the first time I have come before a law court at the age of 70. Hence, I am simply foreign to the manner of speech here. Now, foreign is the word xenos. He's a stranger, right? So just as if I really did happen to be a foreigner, you would surely sympathize with me if I spoke in the dialectic and the way in which I was raised. So also I do beg this of you now, and just as it is, at least as it seems to me, leave aside the manner of my speech, for perhaps it may be worse, but perhaps better, and instead consider the very thing. That's the substance of what he says. Ignore the form of my speech and focus on the substance, the content, the very thing. And apply your mind to this, whether the things I say are just or not. For this is the virtue of a judge, while that of an orator is to speak the truth. The virtue of a judge is to be able to judge whether what he said is just or not. The problem with what he's said here is that what is the standard of justice that's going to be applied to Socrates? Is a natural standard of justice going to be applied? Or is the standard of Athens going to be applied? I think the basic dichotomy here for Plato is, from the point of view of true justice, Socrates is just. From the point of view of the laws of Athens, Socrates is guilty. Again, this duplicitous perspective between the point of view of truth and the opinion of the many. Now he proceeds to talk about the charges. He says, So first, men of Athens, it is just for me to speak in defense against the first false charge against me and the first accusers, and next against the later charges and the later accusers. For many have accused me to you, even long ago, talking now for many years and saying nothing true, and I fear them more than Anytus and those around him, although they too are dangerous. But the others are more dangerous men. Now who's he talking about? He's talking about Aristophanes. This is an important point here. Aristophanes is the true accuser because he's created this poetic image of Socrates in a play called The Clouds, and that has in effect indicted Socrates. He is accusing him implicitly in that play of engaging in certain types of unlawful activities, right? And what is he saying? What's the implicit claim here? The poets shape the opinions of society propagandistically. What we call entertainment is not entertainment. What we call entertainment is actually a form of propaganda promoting us to conform to certain beliefs of society, and that the quarrel between poetry and philosophy has to do with who rules in the city through controlling and ruling the minds of human beings. And the people who Plato concludes really does that is the people who educate the young, the people who shape their minds through entertainments, which of course is not really, it's not just escape. We are constantly told that what we're given our society is escape, when in fact it's shaping our outlook in ways that benefit the order of things. Page 65, he makes this clear. Moreover, they spoke to you, that's Aristophanes, spoke to you at the age when you were most trusting, when some of you were children and youths, and they accused me in a case that simply went by default, for no one spoke in my defense. Right? So what's the significance of youth when you were most trusting? That's when your mind is most malleable, right? Opinion in the cave or the shadows on the wall are just the air you breathe intellectually. It's what you come to know. You don't know any different growing up. You haven't been liberated from the opinions of your society. In particular, Aristophanes' play is one of these idols in the cave that's being cast on the wall and creating this image that everybody accepts as real. And Socrates, I mean, he says he's going to try to disabuse the jury of these views, but he doesn't succeed. Then he goes on to mention the second accusers, and he says, well then, a defense speech must be made, men of Athens. An attempt must be made in this short time to take away from you this slander which you acquired over a long time. Generations. This is 423 BC this play happened. The trial is being held in 399. It means that this has been a generational belief that has been now passed down and accepted with no other evidence than the play and other people believing it themselves. And then he says this at the bottom of 65. He says, nevertheless, let us proceed in whatever way is dear to the God. But the law must be obeyed, and a defense speech must be made. It says, dear to the God. Page 64 at the top, he says, by Zeus. Right? By Zeus. This is like saying in the name of the Lord, and I swear to the Lord, I swear an oath to the Lord. It has the appearance of piety. Here when he says, whatever way is dear to the God, he's not talking about Zeus. He's talking about this daimonia. And the daimonia is only a god that he knows and understands. Other people don't. It's not a god they share in the pantheon. It's his own private god. And then we could even get into the question of, is this really a god at all? Does he really believe it's a god? A divine voice in his head is what we're saying. Is this not just his own judgment, right? A kind of intuition. So then on page 66, he addresses the charges that Aristophanes has leveled against them. And he's accused of corrupting the youth, and he talks about, that he is a teacher. At the bottom of 66, he says, but in fact, none of these things is so. And if you have heard from anyone that I attempt to educate human beings and make money from it, this is not true either. Well, he certainly educates the youth, but he doesn't take money. But you notice how the statement is proposed. Educate humans and make money. And make money. So he's being a bit ironic here. He's saying it's not true because I don't make money. But he does teach. And when you say it's not true, the premise is that both parts of before and after the and are not true. But of course he is a teacher. Though this too seems to me to be noble, if one should be able to educate human beings like Gorgias of Leonidi, Prodicus of Chios, and Hippias of Elis, for each of them, men, is able, going into each of the cities, to persuade the young who can associate with whomever of their own citizens they wish to be free, they persuade these young men to leave off their associations with the latter and to associate with themselves instead, and to give them money and acknowledge gratitude besides. Now these characters are called the sophists, and they actually did teach for money. And he says, what do? He says that persuade the sons of wealthy citizens to leave off their association with the latter, Latter. Well, who is the latter? The latter is the citizens. These teachers persuade the sons of the citizens to break their connections with their parents, right? Now, that sounds something like corrupting the youth. Does Socrates do that? The answer is yes. Is he guilty of corrupting the youth from the point of Athens? It sounds like yes. On page 67, you have this discussion of Callias. He changes gears here, and he talks about, like, if you have a good horse, how do you make the horse really good? You hire a good horse trainer. And you're thinking, why is he talking about these things? What's the relevance? Well, he talks about colts or calves, young horses, training them. Well, this is all just a metaphor for a horse trainer being a teacher and the calves being, young people, that you would make them better through education, right? And the question becomes this: do you believe Socrates is educating the young, or do you believe Socrates is corrupting the young? Now, the answer to that question is this: it's not. It's just like the shadows on the cave. It's not that they disagree about what they see or the evidence that they see. They disagree about the perspective from which they view the evidence, right? We can see the same facts and reach different conclusions based on them. And that's what's happening here. The conventional belief in the cities, Socrates has committed corruption. But from the point of view of maybe, enlightenment or using our reason, he's in fact genuinely educating them. And it depends on what your perspective is. He says, who is knowledgeable in such virtue, that of a human being and a citizen? Now notice he's made the distinction in virtue between a human being and a citizen. And let me spell it out in a nutshell. Virtue is human excellence or excellence. The virtue of a human being and a citizen are not the same thing. We're talking about a human being in light of their human nature, in human being, and a citizen, we're talking about a human being within the context of their political community, right? The virtue of a citizen is, and this is talked about throughout political philosophy, the virtue of a citizen is patriotism. The excellence of a citizen is being a good citizen. And being a good citizen means being patriotic and following the codes of your society. Up to a point, you might even say, my country, right or wrong. It's my country and I need to be patriotic. The human being, as human being, says, no, I'm not going to be excellent in terms of what my society tells is excellent. I'm going to determine what's excellent based on what I think I should do as a human being. Remember, introduction that we looked with video we had. The good life. The goal of this philosophy is to determine the good life. And how is that question formulated? In light of what I am as a human being, what is the right life for me? In light of what I am as a human being, not a citizen, what is the good life for me? The good life of the human being, as such, in their nature, is different from the good life of the citizen. Because we're talking about the distinction between nature, which is and always is fixed on the one hand, and convention on the other. Convention is a habit, a way of life. It's an opinion about what's right. But it's not. It's an opinion that's not brought before the tribunal of reason. So, from the conventional point of view of Athens, Socrates, just to reiterate, Socrates is guilty. And from the point of view of human nature and what is the right life for a human being as such, he's innocent. Not only is he innocent, he's a great man. Now, what is enlightenment all about? Bringing the city before the tribunal of reason. The whole concept of the Enlightenment was to collapse the distinction between human being and citizen and make them one. Which is to say that the goal was to form a regime based on nature rather than mere opinion. And that if it's based on nature, being a good citizen and being a good human being then becomes synonymous. So on page 69, Socrates talks about his friend Chaerephon, who has gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked the priestess of Apollo at Delphi, who is the wisest man of Greece? And the answer, the Pythia says, this is the priestess at the Oracle of Delphi. She says that there is no one wiser than Socrates. Now notice what's said. It doesn't say Socrates is wise. It doesn't say Socrates is wisest. It says no one is wiser than Socrates. Right? And then Chaerephon comes to Athens later on and tells Socrates what he's done. And Socrates says, I pondered this. And he says to himself, whatever is the god saying and what riddle is he posing? The whole idea of the Oracle of Delphi is you went there seeking serious knowledge about life, and that it gave you ambiguous answers that need to be interpreted because they're coming from a god, and as they're translated in human language, they're obscure, they're elliptical, they're not clear. So the classic one is the king of Lydia, Croesus. He wants to go to war against the Persians, I think it was. And he wanted to find out whether it was a good idea to go to war, right? And I think we talked about this example earlier in class. And he says this, he says, should I go to war against the Persians? And of course, you never get a straight answer from the oracle. That's part of the point. You don't get a straight answer. And the answer was, if you go to war, a great empire will fall. And he sits there, oh, great, a great empire will fall. That's the Persian Empire. He goes to war, and what happens? His own empire falls, right? So there's ambiguity. So now he has to prove the meaning of this statement. He says, for I am conscious that I am not at all wise, either much or little. So whatever is he saying when he claims that I am wisest? Surely he is not saying something false, right? Gods don't say falsehoods. At least, for that is not sanctioned for him. So gods speak truly, right? If you think they're saying a falsehood, you just simply don't understand. But then what is his goal? In the next paragraph, he says, I went to one of those reputed to be wise. Now, this is important. A reputation is an appearance, and he wants to determine the reality of it, right? And he says, on the ground that therefore, if anywhere I would refute the divination and show the oracle, this man is wiser than I, but you declared that I was the wisest. So I considered him thoroughly. I did not speak of him by name, but he was one of the politicians. All right, so it is having gone to the oracle and the oracle saying that he is wisest that compels him to then engage in this philosophical life of asking other people questions to determine whether they're wiser than him or not. And he says his goal in life, the origins of his whole philosophical life, or this version, this stage in his life, is to refute the oracle. The oracle is a god, or speaking on behalf of Apollo. To refute what a god said, first of all, he said the gods speak the truth. He is engaged in an impious act here, right? He is trying to prove the god wrong, right? Is he impious? He says this is the goal of his life. Well, you can answer that yourself. So now we get in the next 2 pages to his confrontation with the 3 groups, starting with the politicians. So he says, I went to the politicians, and I talked to one in particular, and conversed with him, men of Athens. He's speaking to the jury. I was affected something like this. It seemed to me that this man seemed to be wise. Are you kidding me? Look how Socrates talks. It seemed to me that this man seemed to be wise. That's a double appearance. It seemed to me that he seemed. So he might seem but not be, and it might seem to me but it might not be. Right? So there's a distancing. Who speaks this way? Clearly not a clever speaker. He seemed to be wise, both to many other human beings, and most of all to himself. So notice what he's saying here. He's not just saying, he seemed to be wise to me, because I'm a good judge, I'm a wise man. He seemed to appear wise to other people, which is no basis for reaching the conclusion that he's wise at all, what the other people think. How can you even know how wise someone is, or whether they're wise or not? You would have to be pretty darn wise to even be able to be that judge and make that discrimination. And then I tried to show him that he supposed he was wise, but he was not. Now you tell me how many people go around, when they hear something false from someone else, they don't just say you're wrong, but I'm now going to try to demonstrate to you why you yourself are not wise, why you yourself are a fool. Can you imagine the response you're going to get from that person? Right? You're going to be derided. They're going to hate you. And if it's a politician, this is a political context. The politician has power, right? And it can be used against you, right? And it actually sounds like in his entire life he has been living, you might even say running from the politicians, by courting other people who he's friends with and getting protection from other people who are also politicians who happen to be sympathetic to him. Why the politicians? Because these are the people who make the laws and they define our society as such. They're powerful people. The poets, why the poets? Because the poets are reputed to be wise and because they shape our society. Right? The artisans shape what's made in society. And it actually turns out they know stuff, whereas the other two don't. Right? Because these people have power, let's be clear, when people have power, what do they want to do? They want to keep it. They want to keep it. And if the reputation on which their power is based is undermined, their power is threatened. And what they really want is not wisdom, they want power. And that's achieved through the appearance. Right? So what Socrates is doing is fundamentally undermining these people's livelihoods. Where is he doing it? He's doing it in public before the young. So what's the charge? He's corrupting the young because he's exposing the charlatans, you might say. He says, for my part, as I went, I reasoned with regard to myself, I am wiser than this human being, for probably neither of us knows anything noble or good, but he supposes he knows something when he does not know. While I, just as I do not know, do not even suppose that I do, I am likely to be a little bit wiser than he in this very thing, that whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose I know. All right, that sounds very convoluted, and really it's designed to be difficult to understand. You can imagine hearing this as a jury. You don't get it read. It's not read sitting as a transcript that you can review. You're hearing it raw and one-shot deal, and you're not going to retain all the nuance of what he's saying, and that's part of the complication. The point is this. The politician thinks he knows what he's talking about, but in fact he doesn't. And the very fact that he's ignorant and thinks that he knows conceals his own ignorance. Not only does he not know his subject matter, he's not even aware of his own ignorance, which prevents him from ever being aware of what he doesn't know. Socrates says, I know enough about the world to know that I don't understand this. And the awareness of my own ignorance is not oxymoronical. It is actually a crucial fact that is going to propel me to go and seek knowledge, to be curious, to understand the world around me. The most important thing. So let's just read on a little bit here and finish up. From there I went to someone else, to one of those who reputed to be wiser than he, and these things seemed to me to be the same. And there I became hateful, both to him and to many others, because Socrates is a threat. And now we see exactly why he's on trial. Exactly why. After this, then, I kept going to one after another, all the while perceiving with pain and fear that I was becoming hated. Nevertheless, it seemed to be necessary to regard the matter of the God as most important. So what is he going to do? I'm taking orders from the God. If I'm getting pushback from people, if I'm getting hated by people, my opinion of them can't matter because I'm a man on a divine mission, right? Of course, does he really believe in Does he really believe in oracles from Delphi, or is this just a pretext, an excuse to do this and cut people down to size? Right? So I had to go, in considering what the oracle was saying, to all those reputed to know something. And by the dog, men of Athens, for it is necessary to speak the truth before you, I swear. What affected something like this. Those with the best reputations seem to me nearly the most deficient in my investigation in accordance with the god. With other things, with more paltry reputations, seem to be men more fit in regard to being prudent. Okay, the bigger the reputation, the less they actually knew. The bigger the reputation, the more they purported to have known. The people with smaller reputations knew more, but they didn't have a reputation for that. Appearance and reality. Indeed, I must display my wanderings to you as performing of certain labors. First of all, these are the labors of Hercules, the labors of Socrates, not heavy lifting, heavy mental lifting, right? And he's going to say he has done in exposing, he is the tribunal of reason. Think about the Enlightenment. He is the mechanism of enlightenment in his own society. He's going to bring the people. To speak about the truth is to speak it in the relationship with entrenched beliefs that other people hold and how they live their lives. He is going to be the one to expose the society. After the politicians, I went to the poets, those of tragedies and dithyrambs and the others, in order that I would catch myself in the act of being more ignorant than they. So I would take up these poems of theirs, which it seemed to me they had worked on the most, and I would ask them thoroughly what they meant, so that I might also learn something from them at the same time. I am ashamed to tell you the truth. No, he's not. He doesn't feel any shame with the truth. Men, nevertheless, it must be said, almost everyone present, so to speak, would have spoken better than the poets did about their own poetry that they themselves had made. So again, now think about how people feel, how the poets feel when he's done this. So again, also concerning the poets, I soon recognized that they do not make what they make by wisdom. They make it by divine inspiration. It's a kind of intuition, but by some sort of nature which inspired, like diviners and those who deliver oracles. Sing to me, muse, of the man of many twists and turns. Sing to me, muse of the man. Begin where you may. For they too say many noble things, but they know nothing about what they speak. So someone can make a really powerful movie, but if you ask them to rationally explain it, they wouldn't be capable of doing it. And of course you might say, well, rational explanation is not what's in order, and it's not appropriate. And I wouldn't disagree with you, but Socrates is concerned, wisdom means really understanding. It was apparent to me that the poets are also affected in the same sort of way. At the same time, I perceived that they supposed, on account of their poetry, that they were the wisest of all human beings, also in order in other things in which they were not. So here's the thing. Because these people think they're wise, not only do they claim to have knowledge over their own shingle, their own discipline, poetry or politics, for example, they also think it means they know other stuff. Have you ever met the person who, because they're smart in one area or know a lot about one area, think they are privileged to opine about every topic? Right? Finally, then, I went to the Manual Artisans, for I was conscious that I had knowledge of nothing, so to speak, but I knew that I would discover that they, at least, had knowledge of many noble things. And I was not played false about this. They did have knowledge of things which I did not have knowledge of, and in the way they were wiser than I. So it turns out, this is very funny, the artisans, the lowest people on the rung out of these three categories, demographics, they actually do have knowledge because they know how to make things. And the proof that they know how to make things is that they actually make them. Right? Artisan like a craftsman. But, men of Athens, the good craftsman also seemed to me to go wrong in the same way as the poets, because he performed his art nobly. Each of one deemed himself wisest also in other things, the greatest things, and this discordant note of theirs seemed to hide that wisdom. So they think they know things that they actually don't, because they do have a certain expertise. So I asked myself on behalf of the oracle whether I would prefer to be as I am, being in no way wise. He's just proven that he's wiser than everybody else. But when he says he's not wise, he's talking about the absolute understanding. He's better than the other people, but he's not truly good. Right? He doesn't have a halo over his head. Or to have both things that they have. I answered myself in the oracle that it profits me to be just as I am. This is the examination, men of Athens, from which I had incurred many hatreds. Examination. The examined life. He examines himself, he examines the society, and he brings it before the tribunal of reason and scrutinizes it. He says this: I incurred many hatreds, the sort that are harshest and gravest, so that many slanders have arisen from them. This is where he's saying the charges really come from, that he pissed a lot of people off. What I did wasn't unlawful. What I did just ruffled a lot of feathers to such an extent that powerful people brought charges against me over time. And I got this name of being wise, for those on each occasion suppose that I myself am wise in the things concerning which I refute someone else, whether it is probable, man, that really the God is wise, and that in this oracle he is saying that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And he appears to say that this of Socrates, he's talking about the oracle now, and to have made use of my name in order to make me a pattern, as if he would say that one of you, O human beings, is wisest, who, like Socrates, has been cognizant that in truth he is worth nothing with respect to wisdom. After Socrates has gone through the scrutiny that he's given these three groups, the politicians, the poets, and the artisans, he turns to his actual life of a citizen. He said he's led a very simple life. It's not been about money. It's been about dedication to the god. And on one hand, he seems to be talking about the oracle at Delphi, which would be connected with Apollo, and therefore a very pious life. On the other hand, he said that it's about his daimonia, which drives him forward in his life. And what it does is when he acts, it prevents him from doing certain things. And he says, for example, I never went into politics because it prevented me from going into it because I knew I would die. Anyway, among his duties as a citizen is he fought very valiantly and was highly respected as a soldier in the Peloponnesian War that the Greeks fought against, or rather the Athenians and their allies. The Athenian Empire fought against Sparta and her allies. And Socrates as a soldier, the primary virtue of a soldier or a warrior is courage. And for Socrates, the real battlefield is everyday society in the agora. And the battle is over truth versus opinion. And he has been a soldier for the truth as a philosopher. And he will stand his station. And he will speak his truth even in the face of death. Even in the face of being convicted to death. And he proposes, he's got the accusers right there. But what he does is propose a statement that one of them makes to him on page 81. And he says, we'll cut a plea deal with you. What if you say you'll never philosophize again and you can walk a free man? And here Socrates stands his ground. He said, this is my life. This is what makes me righteous. This is what makes me pious. This being a soldier, having courage for the truth. Whereas most people in society are just interested in conforming and getting by. So at the top of page 81, he says, he takes the point of view of the jury. And it says, Socrates, now we will obey not Anytus. We will let you go, but on this condition, that you no longer spend time in the investigation But